Well, hello everybody, Roger here, and welcome to my channel, Roger's Reads. So today I'm going to do a brief book review of a book that I recently read entitled The Blue Hour, written by John Rechy. After the Blue Hour is a finalist in the Lambda Literary Awards, so I decided to give it a try. Every year I try to read as many of the finalists as possible. Some are good, some not so good. Now, this book particularly caught my eye as I've read some of Rechy's earlier works, such as The City of Night and Numbers in the late 70s, I think. I don't really remember City of Night, but I do remember that I did not like Numbers for whatever reason. So set in the 1960s, the story follows a 24-year-old writer named John Rechy, who has received a letter from a fan named Paul Wagner, who, after having read some of Rechy's work, invites him to spend the summer on his private island with his sensual mistress Sonia and his very strange and pretty creepy son named Stanty. Stanty's real name is Constantine, but Stanty hated his real name, so everybody calls him Stanty. So a good part of the book involves exploring the sexual dynamics between John and Paul via conversation. These intellectual discussions often devolve into the retelling of past sexual encounters, mostly consisting of Paul sharing hateful memories about his exes. There are times, however, when it sometimes seems as the two men are attempting to mask sexual desires. These conversations take some very strange turns, especially when Paul attempts to draw John out into discussions about the inherent nature of evil and cruelty. And he seems to be trying to get John to admit his own innate cruelty or the pleasure he receives from exercising power over others. Now, it doesn't take us too long to figure out that Paul is not only a master manipulator who wormed his way into money through marriage and divorce, it's also clear that he loves to indulge in power plays and mind games, especially darker ones, and that he might be a rather dangerous person. So this story is told from Rechy's point of view, and throughout these conversations we learn of the protagonist's contempt for both Paul and his potentially mentally unhinged son, which only increases as the days pass on the island. The only positive portrayals are really found in descriptions of Sonia's beauty, and as with the others on the island, there is more to Sonia than meets the eye as well. So what I liked about the book. Now, this book really tickled my bibliophile bone, as books play a large part, or an important part, in the story. John Rechy spends the majority of his time in Paul's vast library, browsing through books by classical authors, and much of the discussion the two men have on the deck revolves around literature. Now, there's also a book entitled The Origins of Evil, which there's a little bit of intrigue surrounding this book. The book was deliberately left out in the open for John to find and then mysteriously disappeared, only to reappear later on in John's room. I also liked the device the author uses of blurring the lines between fiction and nonfiction by using his own name, John Rechy, as the main character and including his own biographical data. Now, in fact, Rechy refers to this book as a true fiction, and I believed at one point in the book he referred to his writing as autobiographical fiction. So whether this means that the story is fiction with a few autobiographical elements thrown in, or whether the novel is an autobiography with some exaggerated truths, is up to the reader to determine. If I recall, Rechy also says something to the effect that all fiction is autobiographical and all autobiographies are fiction. So, on to what I didn't like, or the cons of the book. So, though Stanty was a bit strange, I also got the feeling as I was reading of possible neglect and abuse at the hands of a distant and manipulative father, which might explain some of the boy's strange behavior, which I thought was kind of unsettling. I also disliked the extreme misogynistic views of Paul and his excessively vulgar misogynistic rants, which became very tiresome and offensive after a while. Now, the first time he let loose with one of his rants, it succeeded in providing shock value and adding a certain grittiness to the story, which I understand that can be a plot device. But these repeated rants lost their effectiveness and ended up providing disgust at the continued usage of his hate speech. Now, because of the bitter feelings of the island's owner towards women, including his current mistress, and Rechy's ever-growing dislike for his hosts, I found the entire atmosphere of the novel growing more and more toxic as I progressed through it. There was a feeling of seediness to it that kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. Now, truth be told, I didn't like any of the characters, including our protagonist, John Rechy. So it's difficult to have positive feelings about a book when I felt that none of the characters in that book were deserving of those feelings. They were not only damaged and messy, but I found them wholly unlikable and completely unrelatable, especially Paul. I found him to be a rather vile human being. So I was only about 50 pages from the end of the book, and I actually thought about throwing in the towel and bailing on it. But I figured I was so close to the end and I'd stuck it out this far that I needed to at least finish it. So I was hoping that this huge climax that was promised at the end of the book would be worth it. Well, it wasn't. The big event was more cruel and degrading rather than climatic and explosive, in my very humble opinion. So the verdict. So there is no doubt that Rechy is a master at turning a phrase. This novel was no exception. It was beautifully written and evocative in places, and extremely vulgar and graphic in others. Now, that being said, it did contain elements of suspense, intrigue, mystery, love, desire, but most of this was presented through the guise of conversation which took place either on the sun deck or in the bar. In other words, not a whole lot happens in the book. The characters were interesting, especially once their backgrounds were revealed and we learned a little bit more about them. And so was the setting. The setting was also quite interesting, of the abandoned island. But I don't feel that there was a whole lot here that will stick with me now that I've turned the last page of the book. Additionally, the novel does take the reader into some pretty dark, gritty, and uncomfortable places, which might be difficult for some readers. And because of the continued hate speech of Paul and the almost pornographic actions of the characters, I found this novel kind of difficult to read as I related less and less to the characters and to the story. So I would have to say that this was not a book for me, and I ended up giving it 2 stars. And that is it for the review of After the Blue Hour by John Rechy. As always, I thank you so much for watching, and I really appreciate your support. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.